Hey everyone, it's Lisa K. Real Estate with Lisa K is my channel, and I hope that you guys will join me for a discussion. Today we're going to have a discussion on the new real estate rules. Yes, there are new rules for compensation. Yeah, so we're going to talk about the new real estate rules for compensation. Some of you may say, well, what is this all about? What's going on? Well, essentially, anyone who is out there in the market to buy or sell real estate, if you're using a realtor, you're going to have to deal with realtor compensation. That's how realtors get paid, right? It's been referred to historically as commission, realtors commission. There's a lot of folks out there that are in real estate, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. Real estate commissions. That's how realtors get paid. Before these new rules happened in August with the National Association of Realtors, because they got sued and they lost. Right? Because of that lawsuit, a lot of folks got paid. These are people that are contracting with these realtors to buy or sell property. They got paid. Big lawsuit against the National Association of Realtors over commission structures. There was a time before the lawsuit where you would hear people say, industry standard out there is about 6%. Better not talk that talk anymore. Under the new rules, there is no industry standard. All compensation is negotiable, period. And terms like industry standard is how folks got into trouble, right? Because that sounds like more like some type of collusion or something like that when you talk about industry standards. No, it should be negotiable. The term should be negotiable. So let's go over essentially what the new rules are. Now, first of all, before I get into the rules, do you guys know where realtors go a lot of times to go and show your properties to other realtors? There's something called the MLS, which is the multiple listing service, where realtors can go out there in this sphere and see all properties that are listed online for sale in a certain region, see all type of background information on the property, ways to contact the agent that's representing the seller or buyer, seller in this case, and then ways to reach that seller's agent. And a lot of times, before the change in the law, you could see the commissions right there in the multiple listing service. Can I get an amen from somebody who knows what I'm talking about? Yes, you could see the actual commission structure. Now it's not allowed to be in the multiple listing service. So you cannot see that as the realtor. So you don't know what a seller is offering as commission unless you as a buyer's agent now pick up the phone generally and go communicate with that seller's agent and say, hey, is the seller offering any compensation to the buyer's agent, to the agent that brings a buyer to the seller? Is that seller offering any compensation? You can ask that question now. You have to, because you're not going to know that from looking in the multiple listing services, also known as MLS. You are not going to know that information. You're going to have to pick up the phone and talk. That information won't be in the MLS, and that's one of the first rules. Compensation details are no longer allowed to be in the multiple listing service. Yes. It still can be discussed in person, over the phone, or advertised elsewhere. So that's what the rule says. But not in the multiple listing service. No more information on commissions, period. Pick up the phone, call the agent to find out if you want to know if the seller is offering any commission or any compensation. That's the word, any compensation to the buyer's agent. The other thing is that it used to be a time where you could deal with a buyer, and I was trained, my first broker was Keller Williams. The way I was trained is that you need to have the buyer enter into an agreement with you, right? Like usually we have written agreements with sellers, but it seems like in some cases it's been treated as an optional thing with buyers to enter into buyer agreements. Well, now under the new rules, the National Association of Realtor rules, NAR, you're going to need written buyer agreements. Oh yeah, it has to go in writing now. A written buyer agreement. And some realtors are frankly scared that this could scare buyers off, like, hey, I haven't had to do this before just to look at a property. I have to sign something now just to be able to go and see some properties. Well, yes, that's kind of the new rule. You guys, pardon me, I have a little bit of a cold, and I repeat, I do not want to do my sniffle thing on the screen here, so give me a second. All right, so yes, we're going to need some written buyer agreements now. And so the question is, what is going to go in those agreements? That question has to be answered. We need to know that. And essentially what we're looking at here is that you're going to have a conversation, agent, with the buyer and saying, how much, look, this is what I bring as value as a real estate professional. This is how I'm going to go out and help you find a property, connect all the dots, and get you the property that you want within the time you want and get you closed, right? I'm going to help you navigate that process. That is skill that any real estate professional can bring to a buyer or seller. That's skill to get the job done, make it happen. Am I sweating here? All right, you guys, woo. I don't know why I always get heated up because these lights are on. That's what it is. So now you're going to have to write that thing down, that agreement with the buyer. You're going to sit down with them, and you got to do this now. Under the new rules, you got to do this before you take the buyer out to see that first property, right? You could have a whole property tour lined up with like 15, 20 properties to show the buyer. But now you're going to have a written agreement to say, hey, if I show you a property that you're interested in and you end up purchasing this property, how much are you going to pay me? Like what is going to be the real estate commission? Jeez. Sorry, guys. Wow. So what is going to be the commission in a case like that? And you're going to have a conversation with the buyer. There is no more industry standard, so don't have that conversation. Well, the industry no, don't get yourself in trouble like that because commissions are negotiable. So what you're basically going to do is negotiate a commission, and that's based on the value that you bring as a real estate professional to that buyer. So if you say, look, the value of my services represents a 3% compensation, 3% of the selling price, or the purchase price, then that's what it is. Or if it's 3.5%, or if it's 4%, whatever that value is that you're bringing to that transaction. Thank you guys for checking out my live. I hope you will follow me and like me and share me, and I'm going to continue to put out content, so definitely hang in with me. But yeah, so these are just basic rules that everybody has to be aware with. And so the buyer might be saying, look, I have enough money to purchase my property, and I don't have enough money to pay you commissions. A buyer might be in that position. Like, look, I have just enough down payment money for my property. I got closing costs. Hey, and you tell me I got to bring 3% additional to the table for you, buyer's agent? That's going to be hard. So let me tell you how this actually works out, because if you leave it right there with the buyer is going to be probably a little intimidated by the process, feeling like they're getting themselves into something and they have to sign off on something they don't want to commit to, and they haven't even found their property yet, and you're asking them to sign things that commit them. Well, the commitment only comes, first of all, if you find a property. And what's going to happen in actuality, when your buyer, I'm talking to you as if you're the agent, but when you, the buyer, when you find a property, what your agent's going to do, your agent's going to pick up the phone and going to call the seller's agent and say, hey, my buyer really loves this property and is interested in making an official formal offer on this property. And so I'd like to know, is the seller offering any commission to the buyer's agent? You know, and basically you're saying, for me bringing a buyer to you, Mr. Seller, are you willing to pay any commission or any compensation to the buyer's agent? So you ask that question, and then that seller's agent is going to give an answer. And that answer could be yes. It could be, work with me, it could be no. Yes or no, generally, that's what it's going to be. So yes or no. So if they say yes, then the next question is, I know you know, how much? Right, how much? So they could say, well, my seller is only offering 2% of the selling price as commission to a buyer's agent. And then you're sitting there as the agent saying, well, the value of my services here, I negotiated 3.5 with this buyer over here. And you mean the seller's agent is only going to pay 2? Well, I can take this back to the buyer and say, hey, they'll cover 2, but there's still 1.5. There's 1.5% that you're still going to be on the hook for if you're going to purchase this property. The agreement's in place. And so at that point, this is the cool thing for the buyer. At that point, the buyer can say yes or hecky no. I'm not going for it. It's negotiable. It's always been, in a way. So the buyer can say, no, I'm not paying any commissions. I signed this agreement, but I tell you what, you go out there and you help me identify some properties where the seller is paying at least 3%. And as a buyer, you can say, I only want to see the properties where sellers are paying compensation to the buyer's agent, because I'm not covering you. So if you can find me some properties where the sellers are paying compensation, those are the properties I'll deal with. That's square. That's fine. We can work like that. But if I'm showing you a property and it turns out that the seller is offering no commission and you just love this property and you just got to have this house, and we have an agreement intact and it says you're paying me 3% at closing, then that's the agreement. You see how that works? Or you might say, well, no, I'll tell you what, this is where our ties end. I'm going to go ahead and I will go ahead and deal with the seller's agent myself. I don't need you, Miss Real Estate Lady. I will handle this. I got this. Okay? Business. That's how it goes. That's how it goes in business, right? So these are options. Nobody is bound. Nobody's locked in. Nobody's on the hook for anything right there. So these agreements with buyers that we have to enter into, yes, you're basically saying if the seller is not paying, you're going to be on the hook, and this is the commission rate. And whatever the seller ends up paying, it is going to offset whatever that rate is, generally, that the buyer has agreed to pay you as the buyer's agent. I hope that makes sense, right? So you got to have a written agreement with the buyer, and that's before you even take the buyer out to see a property, if you're the buyer's agent. And you're basically informing the buyer that they're responsible, again, for paying your compensation if the seller doesn't cover the cost. Or even if the seller only covers part of it, that they're responsible for paying the difference, because that's what they have to realize, right? So those are some things that you have to be aware of. Let's see, there's a few other things. I'm just looking at my notes here. Oh yeah, what if you're the realtor and you've just negotiated with the buyer? The buyer says, I'll pay you 3% at closing. If there's no offset on the seller side, I'll agree to pay you 3% at closing. But then you go find this great, fantastic property for the buyer, and they're absolutely in love in it, and they love with it, and they want to pull the trigger, say, right? And you talk to the seller's agent, and the seller's agent say, hey, my seller is willing to pay 6%, 6% to a buyer's agent. And you think, oh my goodness, I just negotiated 3% with the buyer. And over here, they're willing to pay 6%. More money, more money. No, that's not how that works. Whatever your agreement is with the buyer, that's the maximum that you can be compensated as an agent. So if you only agreed to 3% with that buyer, even though that seller's agent is off, they could be offering 19, 25%, almost never unheard of. But I'm just saying, whatever it is on that side, you can't collect that. You can only collect up to the maximum of what was agreed to when you entered that agreement with the buyer. You see what I'm saying? So if it was 3% and they're offering 6%, then you will gladly sign an agreement for you to pay them that 3% that you negotiated with the buyer. So that's how that part works. You cannot, as an agent, receive more compensation for the services that exceed the amount or rate agreed to in the written buyer agreement. That's how that part goes. All right, and so then the one final thing that I want to go over, which is another interesting rule. If a seller offers compensation to a buyer's agent, the seller must approve the amount or the rate in writing. I had that situation recently. So the seller's agent says, look, bring me a buyer. I'm willing to pay X% as compensation to a buyer's agent. Bring me a buyer. And so I, as a buyer's agent, I get out there, I find a buyer, I bring a buyer, buyer sees the property, buyer loves the property, buyer wants to go under contract. I'm then going to get some type of agreement signed right in the beginning where the seller will commit to that agreed upon compensation in writing. In writing. No verbal nothing, right? In writing, signed by the person against whom liability would be a seller. So a seller has to agree to that in writing. If they're going to stand behind it, they agree to it in writing that they're going to pay the buyer's agent that compensation. Once you have that, you can go ahead and negotiate the rest of that contract, those terms and everything for your buyer, just like you normally would. But you got to get the compensation part all down, kind of like in the beginning. And the thing that it seems like it makes some realtors uncomfortable because you're dealing with the commission and compensation stuff right up front in the beginning when you first meet them, before you ever take them out. And so it seems that, a lot of agents are just kind of uncomfortable with that because before these rules, a lot of agents just wouldn't necessarily initially have these types of conversations with buyers, right? It would be more or less, let me get to know you. Let me find out what type of properties you want. Of course, I'm going to make sure that you're qualified to be able to purchase, but I'm going to take you out to find a property. And then, that's just generally how that worked. And then you could see what the seller was offering in the MLS. So you kind of already knew what the compensation was going to be. And it wasn't that much of an issue. So it's a different twist. But buyers, I will say this, buyers have always participated in compensation. They've always been a part of it. It's just that they may not have had these conversations that early and often with their agents, but they've always been a part of the compensation. And let me tell you how real quick. Let me tell you how. Essentially, when do folks get paid in the transaction? People get paid when the buyer brings the money to the closing. That's how things happen. When the buyer brings the money to the closing, that's how the seller's agent gets paid. That's how the buyer's agent gets paid. That's how all the title fee and service charges and everything that's within that transaction, that's how that all gets paid, is when the buyer brings the money to the closing. So the buyer has always participated in the overall compensation within the transaction anyway. Okay, so it's really kind of the same thing. It's just that it's negotiated a little bit differently up front with the buyer. And the more, as like me, as a broker associate in real estate, the more I feel like the more I take the time to explain to my client the process, then they have a comfort level. So to me, it's about making sure your clients are educated in the process so that when things happen, that they understand, okay, this is what is happening. This is what is going on here. And I understand this process because it's been explained to me. And also by the same token, if something doesn't flow along those lines that they've come to understand, they can tell when something seems to be unusual or out of order, you know. So knowledge brings power. So you educate your clients, and then they can roll with you. You can roll with them. Everybody can see eye to eye, and you can get the deal done. So I'm certainly not intimidated by the rules. Like I said, I feel that if type of person I am, if I explain to my clients what's going on and what that process is, I believe they will be able to obviously make informed, intelligent decisions about what they need to do. Well, that's my spin on the lawsuit against the National Association of Realtors and just this whole 6% commission stuff across the board. Out the window. It's all negotiable. Now, just remember, if you're on the seller side and you're trying to sell a property and you want to go and get that property sold and get paid and keep it moving, and you decide that you don't really want to offer any compensation, there may be a lot of buyer's agents who will be skipping showing your property. So don't forget that part, right? So I think sellers need to still incentivize buyers to come see their property and to get under contract with them versus some other property in the neighborhood. You see, it's still a competition out here. So I think sellers have to keep that part in mind. My name is Lisa K. Crawford. I am a broker associate with Balustrade Real Estate here in South Florida, but I can help you with buying or selling real estate no matter where you are in the continental United States or internationally through referral relationships I have with other realtors across the country. So if you need help here or anywhere, you start with me. I'm Lisa K. Crawford. Go check out my website, www.lisacrawfordsellshomes.com. You guys have a wonderful day. Talk to you later.